Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Driven podcast. My name is Sam Parkinson, and you may be wondering why it is that you're listening to my voice again, and yet again, not that of Giles Parkinson. Well, there have been a couple of reshuffles at the Driven recently, and so what that means is for the foreseeable future, at least for the next few episodes, you'll be continuing to hear my voice as your host. Just due to some of the scheduling conflicts with Giles. But not to worry too much. He will be joining us for some interviews and to join the panel in future episodes. But in the meantime, you'll have to put up with me, Sam, as your host. Big shoes to fill, but to help me fill them is the Driven contributor, Tim Eden. Tim, how's it going?
Going well, sir. Well, thank you, Sam. How about yourself?
I'm pretty good, thank you. I'm good. And we're also joined by Ed Lynch-Bell, who is he's a Driven contributor and also the principal at Second Mouse. Ed, how's it going?
Doing very well. Good morning from London.
Yes, from London indeed. Thank you for joining us early in the morning over there. I don't know what the weather's like there. I've heard it's quite warm, which is a bit different to what we're experiencing, at least today in Sydney, where it's very cold and windy. So it's a bit of a unusual reverse of traditional weather patterns, I suppose. But I hear they've been having some warm weather over there. They've got a few things to talk about today. Some things in relation to you being over there in London and in Europe, and some of the things that you've seen whilst over there, Ed. You've been to a couple of EV events, I think, while you've been over there recently. What can you tell us about what you've seen there and just the state of play generally with regards to EV in London and in Europe?
Yeah. So I came over to do a number of things over here. One of the main things was to go to the Electric Vehicle Symposium conference in Gothenburg. So this is an annual event. It's probably one of the most interesting global conferences in the EV space, in that it's an academic event, but also a trade and industry event as well. So it's a fantastic place to go and learn, what's going on in the world, go and learn, what research is being done, the results of that research. It's a pretty intense sort of 3 days. It rotates between Asia, the US, and Europe. Last year I went to Seoul for it. This year's Gothenburg, next year is Long Beach in California. And, really for anybody in the industry, it's well worth considering getting it on your calendar, even though it is, of course, a long way to go. But anyway, event happening in Gothenburg. Gothenburg is a really interesting place. It's a relatively small city, but it's home to Scania, Volvo, Polestar, Zeekr. It's got the biggest Chinese consulate you think you'd ever see in a small city, and that's principally because Geely owns so much of the industry in that town. It's also home to the Research Institutes of Sweden. That's their CSIRO. Their e-mobility division is there. So it's a fantastic place to hold this conference because it's a real sort of focal point for the EV industry, not just in Sweden, but for Europe. So, the show takes place over 3 days, and it's interesting. I mean, this year there was a very heavy focus on trucks. You had Iveco, Daimler, Scania, and Volvo all showing big prime movers. There's a lot of megawatt charging systems. Like, I think every DC fast charger manufacturer there, bar a couple, had a megawatt charger on display. And you had people like Milans, which is the Europe-wide DC fast charging operator. They did a tour of their new Gothenburg charging site. DFDS, which is a big ship operator, talking about their truck operations, which are now increasingly electric. So, I think what's interesting from that perspective is Europe has now sort of settled on, how heavy road freight is going to be decarbonized. And so all the trucks look the same. It's a big cab over prime mover. And It's got a 500 kilowatt hour battery, and a megawatt charging port that's capable of doing 750 kilowatts. And Scania launched that with their charging partner Traton, but all of the other trucks were the same. You kind of ask yourself, well, why is that what's emerging? And so that design fits very much with the rest rules, the rest rules for truck drivers in Europe. So every 5 hours, a truck driver has to stop for 40 minutes. And you kind of sort of do the sums. Well, 500 kilowatt hours, 5 hours. Okay, well, that will get you 400, 500 kilometers down the road. Now, if there aren't too many hills, well, that fits quite comfortably within 500 kilowatt hours. And then you've got a 750 kilowatt charging capability. Okay, well, it's not going to be, that's the peak capability. But that you can see how that sort of fits quite nicely within that 40-minute break. It's very, very different to Australia because our rest rules, actually I had to go and look these up because I didn't know our rest rules are quarter of an hour every 5.5 hours, which makes me less keen to drive late in the day on Australian highways than maybe I would be in Europe. But it does mean that Australia either needs to tighten up its safety rules or needs to think about charging, or it needs to think about decarbonizing heavy road freight in a different way to Europe. So that was one theme, and maybe I'll throw it to you guys and just
in Australia. In Australia, I mean, there's we have bus and truck shows where there are this range of new energy vehicles which are on display, and you can see what is happening in other markets. But there, I don't think there's much of a share of electric vehicles or any kind of new energy vehicles in terms of commercial trucks and buses in Australia. So in London or in Europe, in Gothenburg, is it much different? Are they far ahead, or are they just talking about it more in terms of actual uptake?
So, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, Europe has much stricter rules around emissions reporting, and emissions reduction. And so there are real economic benefits to going electric. But what's held back electrification of that industry has been infrastructure. I mean, it's been a lack of charging. We hear this a lot of things, and there has been some debate about how best this should be approached, and there are lots of solutions. I mean, pushing more freight onto rail is a good idea, although rail capacity is limited and it doesn't go everywhere you want to go. There have been trials of overhead power systems on some of the motorways in Germany. So kind of like a railway where you've got two wires running above the truck and you've got a pantograph and it kind of runs under the pantograph. But that's, expensive from an infrastructure perspective. But it does mean that, you can have a much smaller battery. And of course, hydrogen has been trialed, but I think it's sort of fairly safe to say that that's been sort of put to bed in Europe. So, but, nonetheless, I mean, there have been, some quite big, fleets transitioning, at the show, DFDS, which is a big Danish shipping operation, 90% of their business is ships, but they operate a lot of trucks as well. And they were very keen to talk about how they'd gone early on buying trucks from Volvo. And I think they bought 140 trucks, 70 of which were based in Gothenburg. And they were initially doing sort of fairly short run trips from the port in Gothenburg. So Gothenburg's probably the most important container port in the Nordics. But it was doing distribution out to distribution centers from that port, doing runs, maybe as far as Oslo, which is not that, it's not that far away. So they were talking about that, but also sort of talking about the future in there. So there are I wouldn't say that there is a big penetration, a big share on electric trucks at the moment, but I think that everything's in place for that to change quite quickly now.
So they've got a more sort of conducive environment to faster uptake than we do in Australia, and that's, by the sounds of it, partly due to the policy environment. And one of the most obvious questions would be also, how does that apply to Australia, considering that the vast differences in the distances in which trucks travel here, as opposed to countries in Europe. So is that something which may pose a serious barrier to replicating some of the things that are happening in European countries with regards to the commercial vehicle industry and the electrification of it, or is it something which needn't necessarily be such a barrier? I'm talking about the distance, in Australia to replicating what's happening in other markets.
Yeah, so I don't see the distance as a problem, and there's a couple of ways to approach this. I mean, first of all, there's a lot of short haul heavy vehicles. You can do an out and back. So, for instance, distribution from ports is kind of a classic example, and actually, the shining example of this one is the Port of Long Beach, which is done a lot to improve the air quality in Los Angeles by shifting a lot of their short haul distribution of containers onto electric trucks. So that that's something that you could do very, very easily and very, very quickly in Australia. Long haul, it does come down to infrastructure, and it does come down to different, or potentially different approaches. Like I say, our rest rules are different. They're not as conducive to megawatt charging. And you go and talk to the logistics providers, and they want to sweat their assets. They want freight to move as quickly as possible. They don't like paying drivers to sit around. Fair enough. It's a business. So maybe battery swapping is the answer. We've got Janus, of course. There's Solar H2E that the Melbourne EV meetup a couple of months ago talked about their Sani battery swapping trucks that they want to bring into Australia. And then, of course, Photon launched their hydrogen truck tomorrow. I mean, I remain skeptical on hydrogen just because it's got so many cost hurdles to overcome, and whether it's battery swapping or whether it's straight battery powered prime movers, the scale is there. It's coming out of China. It's coming out of Europe. Volvo, have announced that they're going to put together trucks in Queensland. Scania is going to bring their electric trucks. So I am skeptical that hydrogen will get much of a go. I think one interesting thing that is being trialed in California, and I have to say I always blank on the name of the company that's doing it, but there's another way of swapping, and rather than swapping batteries, you swap prime movers. Because what do you care as a shipper most? You care that if you're shipping freight, it gets there as fast as possible. And so why not have a prime mover, drive 400 kilometers? The driver needs to take a rest. You unhook the prime mover, because it's a module in and all of itself, and then next prime mover backs on and then takes the load forward, and then the driver and his prime mover can either take the next load forward or turn around and take a load going the other way. It's the Pony Express basically, but you're doing it with big trucks. Now, there are structural issues in the industry. The industry doesn't work like that, but there's no reason why you couldn't do that. You can swap a driver, you can swap a prime mover, you can swap a load, and you can maximize utilization by cleaving to the different schedules of those and keep charging. So I think we're going to come up with different solutions. I think we're going to have to look at how we power remote charging, and I think that comes with, remote energy generation. Because I think that in a lot of places, you're going to be asking an awfully large amount of the grid, and so co-locating with solar, batteries, wind, other forms of renewable generation, are going to. I think is going to be obligatory in many places, and it's also a cost benefit. You keep the network out of it. If you're behind the same meter, then not only is the charger going to get the cheapest energy that it can because there's no network involved, but also, a solar developer is going to get the best price for their energy, or a guaranteed price from their energy, because there's a customer on site buying that energy to put in trucks. So I think there's a really interesting opportunity there, aligning renewable development with an on-site customer in the form of truck charging.
Yeah. Wow, fascinating. I mean, I think it's interesting to hear the kind of momentum it's picking up over there in Europe, and it will be really interesting to see how and when that momentum will translate into the Australian market. But it certainly feels like, just from a pure cost benefit perspective, it's really just a matter of when rather than, and how rather than if, for the heavy industries. We're going to flick over to just wanted to touch base on an article that you wrote, Ed, not too long ago, last week, I think, about the BYD V2G bundle. So this is BYD offering a V2G bundle. So basically, it means that you're going to, along with your BYD Dolphin, you're also going to get a V2G capability, and it's something which I think they've launched in the UK. Is that right?
That's correct.
Just at this stage, it's not.
Yeah.
Just yeah. So, can you tell us a bit about this and how that works exactly?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's not a huge amount of detail. So, it's London Climate Action Week this week. And the first day, there's lots of events happening around the city, but the first day was Octopus's Energy Tech Summit. And so Octopus is, it's the UK's largest electricity retailer. It's also the largest roaming network, or the largest roaming EV charging provider. They also have a car leasing business. And they sit under the Octopus Electroverse ban. And of course, Octopus is part owned by Australia's very own Origin Energy, who extensively use their software to power their retail operations. So, there's an Australian link there. So anyway, and Octopus have grown from nothing to this position of being the largest energy company very, very quickly. It's less than 10 years. And they've done it through a really high quality product innovation capability. They have an excellent customer experience, and they invest a lot in new and innovative products. They've invested a lot in connecting solar and DER and all of these things, and really making it work for customers. So they're a good story. So this then is their product. This is they've been leasing EVs and installing chargers and providing control of smart chargers under energy products for quite some time now. But this is their first V2G product, and it might be the first commercial V2G product in the UK. I don't know. And so the offer is you lease a BYD Dolphin. It costs £300 a month. You have to connect to an Octopus electricity tariff. I think the lease is variable depending on the number of included miles. You get free charging, and then they monetize the V2G so that you then get a credit or savings on your electricity bill. And they're sort of saying that if you have a sort of a 7,000 mile a year lease, You connect the battery, then your car, then you could save, I think they're saying £620 a year on your electricity bills and £1,000 a year on your vehicle costs, and they're comparing with an ICE vehicle. So there's quite a lot of work being done under the line there. The catch is, and I don't see this as a massive catch, is that you have to connect your vehicle to the charger a minimum of 20 times a month, and those 20 times have to be for 20 hours. 12 hours. Sorry, 12 hours at a time, and that's so that they can.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it's about 240 hours a month.
Yes.
Something. Is that right?
So
Roughly, yeah.
the car has to spend 1/3 of its life connected and at home, which now I will caveat this by saying I don't own a car and I haven't owned a car for a very long time, and that doesn't sound particularly hard to achieve given how little I see cars moving. But then quite a lot of people, I think, some wonderful commenters on the Driven sort of threw their hands up and go, well, I'd never do that. Why would I restrict myself like that? But, cars aren't particularly heavily utilized assets. And for somebody that is doing a sort of a typical, daily commute, school run, shopping, that doesn't seem like a particularly difficult condition to fulfill. But, caveat, I don't own a car, and maybe I'm wrong. So,
well, Tim, you own a car. How does that appeal to you?
I mean, it definitely sounds interesting. It'd be good to look into and see what the actual conditions are. I'm not sure if you know it, but what happens if you don't meet that criteria? I think, yeah, like you said, on paper, it probably sounds okay, but there's probably times when you're like, oh, man, I need to duck out to the shops and the car's only been plugged in for 8 hours or 9 hours, and I've got to sort of interrupt that 12-hour window. So, it'd be hard to know exactly how much impact that's going to have, but it's definitely not for everyone, I'd say.
Yeah. I mean, the T's and C's were pretty light on in terms of details about what the sort of penalties were, and indeed what the benefits might be if you did more than 20 days a month. So, you can imagine, I go away on holiday and the car's just sitting there. Oh, do I get an extra benefit because they can use it more because it's plugged in but 24 hours instead of 12. So, so I mean, I would call this sort of story as developing. Nobody's got one of these yet, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on, not least because, we have BYD cars in Australia, Origin runs on top of Octopus, and Zaptec, which is the charger provider doing this. They were just launched by SEVR at the Sydney EV Summit last week. So all of the bits are in Australia to do this. Probably the bit that's missing is the connection rules and the standards that will allow you to connect what is, I think 99% certain that this is an AC vehicle to grid product. I just haven't seen it written down anywhere. I'm not aware that Zaptec makes a DC V2G charger, but until somebody tells me exactly what it is, I'm not going to say 100% that it is. But we've got to a point where we can connect DC vehicle to grid chargers, but AC vehicle to grid needs more work in Australia. However,
Is there a reason why? Sorry, Greg. Is there a reason why? I was just wondering why the Dolphin in particular why is it exclusive to that particular model and BYD fleet? Is it because it's the only one that has capability, or is it just it's just what they thought they'd try it to start off with? Is there a particular reason?
So the answer is I don't know. And prior to this announcement, I wasn't even aware that any BYD vehicles had V2G capability. But obviously, it's fantastic that the Dolphin does. And And I mean, the other sort of question is how they are doing it, because there's quite a lot of proprietary. This is almost certainly not standards based. There's quite a lot of proprietary tech. Zaptec manages their chargers with a direct interface to their cloud, and if you want a standards based interface, you're going cloud to cloud rather than direct to the charger. So, but of course, by doing that, Zaptec have been able to take a forward position. And again, I don't know if the BYD and the Zaptec are using ISO 15118 to achieve this, which is the standard that governs this and many other things, or whether there's something proprietary happening here. So I think this is one of these stories that's sort of evolving and developing, and I will certainly do some digging to find out more what both whilst I'm here and from BYD in Australia.
I mean, I imagine Octopus will be looking at this as a good way to see what the appetite is for this kind of model. Is it a niche idea, or is it that a few people in techie people might take up, or is it something which could potentially be quite mainstream? I mean, the way I see it, it's interesting because the proposal is, in a way, when you think about the benefits of vehicle to load and in vehicles, it kind of revolves around this idea of increasing your energy independence and being able to take almost one step away from the grid in some respects. And so a V2G program like this, in a way, it kind of chains you literally to the charger, to the grid, with a kind of requirement to provide a certain amount of energy. I think it'll be really interesting to see how people respond to that, and whether that is something that is going to be a popular idea in the wider market, or is this going to remain in?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of an interesting moment. I mean, the UK is much further along their net zero pathway than Australia is. It's had it does seem to be fracturing right now, but there has been sort of bipartisan commitment to a net zero by 2050 target. And actually, this is, what's interesting is this comes after announcement either last week or the week before that they're changing the building code so that all new houses in the UK will have to have solar on the roof, right? That so it gets solar, and I think there's maybe a sort of a different attitude. I mean, it's hard to generalize, but I think that it's much harder to be independent in the UK. Everyone lives close together. It's smaller houses, smaller roofs, and of course, much less sunshine. So, the idea that you can be independent from the grids is maybe less of an idea. And of course, one of the challenges with the uptake of this product is there are many, many fewer single family homes. Australia's, I think, 85% people live in like single family homes or townhouses, likely to have a garage or a driveway at least. That's much, much lower in the UK. So that obviously restricts uptake. One thing that was interesting about the announcement was that this vehicle would be available through the Motability scheme. And this is kind of interesting because the Motability scheme is a way for people in receipt of certain benefits for disability. So equivalent of our NDIS are able to access vehicles using their mobility component of that benefit. And there are also a number of tax benefits that the scheme receives that allows them to offer vehicles cheaper than they otherwise would be. So I think one of the sort of the interesting part of the story is that there's an equity component built in. Now, it's not utterly selfless. Motability is Europe's biggest fleet. They have Europe's biggest fleet of cars. 1/5 of all vehicles in the UK are purchased by Motability on behalf of disabled people. And they adapt vehicles, hand controls, wheelchairs, but, not all disabilities are visible. So, lots of people have access to this scheme. But it does mean that this is a scheme that is available, that this Octopus product is available to people who may have, lower incomes, they're on benefits, which broadens the potential uptake. And it also means that, some of the people who might benefit most from the cost of living savings of this product are actually going to be able to access it. Whereas in Australia, typically it tends to be sort of, wealthier people who can afford to invest in, solar batteries, EV chargers, this kind of thing. So they're doing a lot to make this as broadly appealing as possible.
Yeah, we'll be interested to see whether that increases, equity or the sort of equal access to TVs or not. I think I was going to ask a few questions about predictions and how this is going to roll out, but I think the answer is going to be let's wait and find out. But we'll certainly be keeping a close eye on it on the Driven. So yeah, I think it's an interesting idea. Interesting to see whether Australians are ready for the idea of renting out their EV batteries to the grid. It'll be interesting to see whether it reshapes the way in which people see leasing versus owning a vehicle. If this becomes something which ends up being quite a good, interesting proposal to the mass market, how that reshapes leasing vehicles more broadly. But anyway, let's watch that space and see what happens. It'll be really interesting. Just moving on to some of the other news of the week. We saw that Tesla launched their RoboTaxi in the United States in Austin. And Tim, we touched on this last episode with Riz, and he was I think he had pretty keen or pretty optimistic views on how that's going to go in terms of RoboTaxi's ability to penetrate the market. And I wonder, in your view, is that something which you see as optimistically as Riz, or do you think it's just something which is a bit of a potential gimmick that might die off in the near future? I saw that they launched it at I think it's $4.20 per ride. I think that's US dollars. But whether it scales up or not, I guess, is the big question.
Yeah, it's definitely a big question, Sam. The $4.20 per ride, that's an initial sort of fixed rate that they've got. I believe, I'm not sure when they'll sort of change that to a per kilometer or per time kind of thing, like most other ride sharing or things like Uber. To answer your question, though, I think it's pretty hard to tell at this stage. Just to sort of put some numbers to the launch that's happened so far. So from what we know so far, there's about 20 Tesla Model Y vehicles. This is not using Tesla's RoboTaxi, the Cybercab that they called it, the sort of purpose-built RoboTaxi. It's just using regular Tesla Model Y vehicles, the latest version. There's only about 20 of those cars. At the moment, they've got a safety driver sitting in the front seat, sort of ready to push a kill switch if they need to. They've also got, I'm not sure if it's all the cars or just some of the cars, but they've got like a sort of another Tesla vehicle tailing it with people on board who presumably have direct access via a wireless connection to the car to either control it if they need to or to access another kill switch. So there's quite a lot of safety at this early stage, which is interesting. I'm guessing they, that's maybe there for regulations to sort of make sure that, it's safe if something goes wrong. Looking at some of the other cars, autonomous driving companies out there like Waymo and Cruise. Waymo is probably the biggest one in the US that they do on the order of millions of rides a year, I think it is. And they've been sort of testing their cars for many years now.
Yeah, well, it's important to note that this isn't Tesla is not the first company to be doing this. There are other companies, like you said, Waymo, Cruise, and I think there are some others in the US market already. Do we know how Tesla's version of this stacks up against those existing businesses? In terms of of safety, in terms of features, tech, scale. Is it? Do we have an idea as to how it stacks up?
Well, I think on the surface, it stacks up very similar in terms of you've got an app on your phone, you pull out, you request a ride, car turns up, you jump in. So on the surface, obviously the user experience is pretty similar, I would say. Probably the biggest difference is the way that these companies are implementing the actual way the car sees the world, and the biggest difference would be the use of LiDAR. So Elon Musk and Tesla are pretty famous for coming out there and saying you don't need LiDAR. Humans only have eyes and limbs, and they can control a car and drive a car. So a robot taxi should be able to do it with just cameras. I think that's an interesting point. I think it's not just your eyes. We also have ears and other things that we use to hear cars and hear like emergency vehicles behind us and things like that. So we don't rely purely on our vision to drive. The other thing, so those other companies like Waymo, they have a lot more sensors on the car. They're using LiDAR, which is a very high definition sort of 3D view of the world that car's getting. So I would imagine from the car's point of view, it can see a lot more detail about what's happening, other cars, other pedestrians, bikes, those kind of things. I know, I used to work at Google previously when Google first started testing these self-driving cars back before Waymo was born as a separate company, and the stuff they were doing, even 10 plus years ago was very advanced and very, very cool stuff that they were doing. And then that reminds me, there was an interesting sort of time in that history of Google's self-driving effort where initially they were trying the sort of slowly incremental approach that Tesla's been doing, where they're sort of gradually trying to move up the sort of levels of autonomy from level 1, level 2, level 3. And they got to this point where people started to trust the system, and these were just sort of Google engineers that would have these cars and drive them to and from work and those kind of things. And it got to the point where the cars got so good that people were sort of become a bit complacent, and they would be, they were caught checking their phone or checking their email or not paying attention because they got to sort of trust the cars. And at that point, Google made that decision just to, this is going to be dangerous if we sort of continue down this path. So what they did was decide, let's just go for full autonomy from the start, and not require any attention from the driver, because otherwise you're going to have this transition period where people are going to have accidents and not be paying attention.
Of course, you don't need any autonomy to experience the fear of as a cyclist of people driving around on their phones, etc., etc. So, it's kind of an interesting. It's an interesting one. I mean, I fear autonomy, but not necessarily for the reason that I think the car's going to kill me, because I've experienced the average Melbourne driver on a daily basis. Although, it's worth noting that the US National Highway Traffic Safety Administration is already investigating Tesla, because apparently there's been some erratic behavior from the vehicles. But, I don't think that necessarily puts them out of the norm, because I know, Waymo and others. I mean, my first autonomous vehicle ride was in an Uber in Pittsburgh in like 2016, and we've two very, very anxious engineers in the front stewarding the car, which got to one of Pittsburgh's very complicated freeway intersections and then just stopped in the middle of the road because it couldn't deal with the spaghetti of the road network there. But yeah, no, actually, the bigger fear that I have around autonomy is that, we have a situation where I think this is another stat that I hold in my head, and I must go and get a proper citation for it. But in Melbourne in the 70s, the average occupancy of a vehicle was over 2 at about like 2.1. The average occupancy of a vehicle in Melbourne today is about 1.1. And if you've got autonomous vehicles out there doing work, then it can go below 1. And so there are some great opportunities with autonomy. It might free people from owning cars, or more people from owning cars. It might, lower the costs of, zero carbon transportation, but it also might send congestion through the roof. And so, and that's probably my biggest fear about autonomy, is it makes our cities worse places to live, because we've got just more cars just wandering around, not doing anything productive.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. What are the potential impacts of a really scaled up autonomous robotaxi sort of model? What are the knock on effects for public transport? For private car ownership and as you said, congestion. So it's I mean, Tim, do you sort of subscribe to that view that it's I don't know why, but I feel like when I thought about robotaxis and automated transport, I thought that's going to reduce congestion because people won't own a car and they won't make as many trips as they might have done because they don't have their own car, and they'll give a bit more thought to using a car rather than public transport to get around, or a bike. But on the other hand, having thought about it, it could actually do what Ed was suggesting and actually just increase the amount of car trips that are being done, such as the convenience that you can sort of summon one to you at any time.
Definitely. I share Ed's concerns there about, particularly if it's so cheap. I mean, people might just decide, I can rent one of these autonomous taxis and take me somewhere, take me to the city even. So I'll jump on one of those instead of getting on a train, which is obviously going to be a negative in terms of cars on the road, like Ed said, maybe potentially increasing congestion. I mean, I have heard the people like Tony Sebo, the futurist guy, talking about how we'll have this great world where much less cars on the road, and we'll be able to turn car parks into grass and parklands and things like that again. But I think that's, obviously time will tell if that we do get to that eventually. But I think it's potentially an idealistic view. I think people really enjoy owning their cars. There's the convenience of owning a car, not just using the rideshare, but people like to own their own cars and have their own stuff in it. Particularly like yourself, Sam, you've got young kids. You probably have a pram and various things in the car that you don't want to have to take in and out when you if you book a robo-taxi, you don't want to have to chuckle your stuff in every time you go somewhere. So
yeah, that's true. But if I can summon one very quickly, and I don't have to do a small talk conversation every time I'm in a taxi, and I don't have to pay the cost of owning a vehicle, or two, I can see why some people might consider it. But yeah, there's quite a few things to consider there. I mean, if you had to make a bold prediction now as to, in 5 years' time, are these kind of robotaxis going to be part of daily life, or are we just going to be stuck in permanent pilot mode?
I think 5 years is way too early. We'll still be in very early trials and sort of niche markets. I think, like we said before, Waymo's scaled up quite a bit in the US, but they're still only offering geofenced services in maybe I think 3 or 4 cities at this point. So yeah, still very early days. I mean, Tesla has the vision. No pun intended, but they have the plan to use their vision-based system to sort of quickly roll out anywhere without having to do as much sort of mapping of areas and things like that Waymo does. But given their track record of announcing, way back in 2016 that the cars they produce from then will be capable of full autonomy, and that's obviously hasn't turned out to be true. So I take what they say with a big grain of salt at this point. I think most people do. So.
Actually, I just wanted to pick up just an interesting observation there about young kids. I mean, so I've got a toddler and car-free lifestyle, and happy to advertise that to anybody. And we've got a pram that fits on the bike. Admittedly, we've got a bike that fits the pram as well. But an interesting observation from London is that if you get in a black cab in London with a child, you don't have to have a car seat. In fact, we found this out because we arrived at Heathrow and we've got a car seat, and I started plugging it in. And a very nice cabbie called Trevor said, "You're the first person I've ever seen put a car seat in the back of my cab," and it's got the ISOFIX and everything. So it all, we did it because I was halfway through the job anyway. But we like to be safe. But that's it's. for, if you don't own a car, yes, you can get away with, car share and bikes, but every now and again you do need a taxi or a ride share, those kind of shared modes. And if you haven't got a car seat, then you're stuffed in Australia. And so there's if we do want to see a future where there's a lot more shared modes, and I include, autonomous and non-autonomous rideshare in that, then, we have to enable people to make those choices and, think about what the most appropriate rules around that might be. Because I think I run into this all the time. It's sort of a default opinion in Australia. If you have a child, you must have a car, because it's impossible to get to all the things, get to school, get to sports, get to all those things if you don't have a car. To which the answer I would always say is bicycle. But I'm that
Well,
guy.
I think some people would say you don't need a car, you need a truck, and in fact you need two trucks at all times. Because it seems to be the approach of many of quite a few people certainly in Sydney. I mean, the amount of Land Rovers that I see in the inner suburbs of Sydney, so they can drive their two kids 1.5 kilometers to school and back. It's we do have we've said this before. Australia, we love utes, we love big cars. I'm seeing more of these Rams on the street. So I think that there is quite a big sort of re-education piece in terms of not just robotaxis, but also the idea of having carless lifestyles. So I think it feels like Australia is still some way to go in that respect. But anyway, we'll find out as time goes on. There's one more thing I just wanted to touch on. One of the articles, Ed, from last week as well, was just about how car share EVs are also doing V2G, and then needn't necessarily be limited to homes with parking. In Australia, traditionally we have a very big culture of having your own freestanding home with a garage. But as time goes on and houses are getting more and more expensive, a lot more people are not enjoying the luxury of their own garage. And so, I mean, this is an interesting article because it touches on how V2G can be leveraged even without having a garage or off-street parking at your home. Could you just briefly outline what that was about?
Yeah, so there's an organisation called We Drive Solar. They're a Dutch organisation run by a guy called Robin Berg, who's very prolific on LinkedIn. You can find out exactly what he's doing very, very easily. And so they've partnered with the local car share operator to put 50 V2G cars on the car sharing network, and there are already EVs on that car sharing network, but these are 50 V2G cars. And so they're all Renault 5s. And in fact, the presentation was between We Drive Solar and Ampere, the CTO of Ampere. Ampere is Renault sort of spun out digital division, so their software provider. And so how it works is the cars, they sit there. We Drive Solar have provided the charger. The car share operator has connected to the charge station management platform, and so is feeding the booking information into the system, so that such that the cars are always ready to go when somebody wants to use them. But from my own experience of car share, these cars do a lot of sitting around. They're pretty heavily used on the weekends, but during the week you can get pretty much what you want when you want. So they're sort of sitting around. And so what they're then doing is they're operating the cars in V2G mode. It's AC V2G, definitely on this one. And so while the cars are not moving and while there's not an upcoming booking, they're basically acting as batteries sitting in the street. And this is fantastic for lots of reasons. The Netherlands, well, I think Robin claimed they had more solar panels than anyone else in the world, but Australia actually, on a per capita basis, beats the Netherlands. But the Netherlands is not far behind. They've gone very, very heavy on solar, so they've got similar problems to we have. They have a lot of excess generation during the day, and then they have the classic duck curve and higher energy prices as the solar comes off in the evening. And so what's kind of exciting about this is a sort of a dual use community battery. If you go around my neighborhood in Melbourne, City of Yarra, there's a lot of car share. We've got relatively low levels of car ownership. And we've got FlexiCar, Kinto, Turo, GoGet, Popcar, loads of operators. So there's loads of different vehicles. And if you go and talk to car share operators, they're seeing sort of 20, 30% utilization as good on those vehicles. And so this second use is fantastic. I mean, this is a really easy way potentially to do community batteries. You can put a community vehicle on a high penetration solar feeder, and you can use those cars for the 70% of the time they're not being used as cars as batteries. And that makes the car share business more viable. Car share is pretty marginal. I mean, you go and talk to the likes of GoGet, and they'll tell you what the economics are, and they're not great. And so that it's an extra income stream there, but also you've got that that grid stabilization, that energy management benefit where it matters most, which is on your high penetration solar residential street. So I think there's a fantastic opportunity to bring this to Australia. And Renault are very, very bullish on this. I think the most significant thing that I heard is that CTO of Ampere said, this does not affect your warranty. We will allow within the 8-year battery warranty on the vehicle, intensive vehicle to grid use. And he said the word intensive, so they're very positive. They also said that this won't be an option. This will be on all Renault 5s, and then it will be extended to Renault 4, which is their even smaller car, Megane, Scenic, which is their mini people mover and might be their most popular vehicle. So certainly has been for a long time. And so they're very much on the front foot. So my sort of hope is that Teco, who are the Australian importer of Renault, really kind of sees this one and sort of see the opportunity with this. Not least because they've chosen, as far as I can tell, to only bring in the high performance version of the Renault 5, not the everyday version. And then just as a sort of a coda to this, Nissan was showing off their new Leaf at the show, but they also had their Nissan Micra. And the Nissan Micra is the same car as the Renault 5 underneath. And this is another, I think I didn't do an article, but I put a LinkedIn post about this. This is, I love small cars. I love small and light cars. And this is another small, light, economical electric vehicle that's not coming to Australia. And if it does share enough of the same underpinnings as the Renault 5, then it has, it potentially has that same capability to do V2G.
Well, I mean, yeah, we don't see a lot of small EVs in Australia, I think, relative to other markets. It's I mean, Tim, we looked at you drove the latest Hyundai Insta, but we're not exactly flooded with options, and even Hyundai reckon that it's not really a goer for Australia. I mean, they're sort of putting it out there, and they're saying, well, we don't see this being a mass market option. But yeah, which is an interesting take from the people who manufacture the car. But I mean, what potential do you see integration of V2G and car sharing fleets for urban areas that lack parking spaces? Do you see much there in the Australian market?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. Like Ed said, I mean, if these cars are sitting there 70% of the time not being utilized, I think it's great if they can be plugged in and be batteries on wheels. Just like any other community battery or home or grid scale battery, they can be providing grid services like frequency control and shifting energy from those daytime peaks to evening peaks. Obviously, as we get more and more renewables on the grid, Giles is the expert on this, but we're going to need a lot more storage in the grid, so we can do it every way possible. I think that's fantastic. I just wonder if there's going to be like a reminder for people to plug in when they park the car and leave it, because I was saying earlier before we started recording that even with, I've got a energy retailer that gives me free charging during the middle of the day, and sometimes we forget to plug it in, and I walk past the car later and go, oh damn, I forgot to plug it in, and got that free period of charging. So hopefully this is a system that works where people reliably plug it in.
Yeah, well, at least with car share, you can. You get pretty quickly penalised for bringing the car back late, bringing the car back messy, and a number of other infractions. So I think not plugging it in goes on the list of things you get charged $25 for. So it's possibly easier to insure people plug in the car share car than your own one at home. So
So I mean, maybe Ed, we may not necessarily need substantial or significant regulatory or infrastructural changes to make V2G car sharing successful in Australia.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the challenge there is that the grid connection rules, AS 4777, the inverter standard, doesn't really imagine a world in which the inverter moves around. And that's what you have in the AC V2G situation. And I think there's a lot of debate as to whether we're going to have DC V2G or AC V2G. And I think the reality is we're going to have both. Manufacturers are going down different pathways with this, but in the case of AC V2G, the cost is all in the vehicle. The charge is very much the same as another smart charger. In fact, there were any number of chargers from brands like Defa and I can't remember other brand, but Defa, a Norwegian brand. They're saying, oh well, all of our chargers are AC V2G ready, and in fact, they were sort of talking about the fact that they were trialing this with unnamed manufacturers, possibly from possibly from an area not too far away from the EVS show. So there's definitely that, and I think certainly this is AC V2G, and as I say, the regulations don't really imagine that the inverter moves around. And so there's definitely some work that needs to be done by industry, by academia, to just to go through the process and work out how we can make this this system compliant with the rules which are there to protect people, electricians, all of these kind of things, the grid, etc. They're very sensible. And I know, I've spoken with Laura Jones over at ANU. She's very, very keen to get an AC V2G set up going in the lab there to work through some of these issues. And she's obviously been part of a lot of the work on DC V2G. In fact, I will use this just to call out to manufacturers, because she's got any number of people willing to offer her chargers and software and expertise. Getting an Australian OEM on board to provide a vehicle and switch on the capability has been very, very hard. So, there's an opportunity here for someone to be first, Hyundai, Iveco, Volvo, Polestar, this is in your hands. We could get this going, and we could do this with car share. We could sell a lot more EVs because it's certainly a very interesting consumer feature. But we have to go through this process of making sure that we can safely comply with the various laws and regulations here in Australia.
There you go. Oh well, Renault, Volvo, if you're listening, have a think about it. Cool. All right. Well, look, let's just finally before we sign off, because I think we've that time we wrap it up. But you mentioned, Ed, before we started recording, just a quick observation about just the differences between London and Sydney, who share many parallels in some ways at least, but not with regards to curbside charging, where it's Sydney, it can be a source of local controversy at times. Certainly in my area, the council has started rolling out in Sydney some curbside charging, but not without some pushback from people who don't like it being outside their home. They don't see why it should be in places where other people could park, as opposed to having to go to a servo, for example, to do your filling up the tank, so to speak. But in London, sounds like that's they're kind of past that, and it's pretty ubiquitous.
Yeah, no, and so I'm staying at my dad's place. He lives in the city of Westminster, and the city of Westminster went very early on EV charging. I mean, some of their EV chargers have been here for over 10 years, if not longer. And in fact, one of the ways that Westminster Council used to incentivize EVs was providing free parking, which, given that parking costs $15 an hour for curbside parking in some parts of the city of Westminster, it's gone now, but that was quite a substantial benefit, and it encouraged a lot of people. Plus, when the congestion charge came in, EVs got to drive around central London for free when everyone else had to pay a tenner. So but basically, I mean, Westminster kind of led the way. Every lamppost has a charger built into it. There are bollards on every pavement, and older, sort of bigger charging posts on every pavement in Westminster. And so the parking issue largely has gone away, because not least because there's a higher penetration of EVs, but also because there's just so much charging. It doesn't like if there's an ICE vehicle parked in front of the charger, well, go 20 meters down the road and there's another charger. I mean, it's not really a problem. I guess the other sort of interesting thing is, in the UK, you don't have to park in the direction of travel, which also means that you're much more able to orient your car with the position of the charger, which then sort of goes to sort of how it's been approached in other neighbourhoods. So the neighbourhood I grew up in, Hackney, they've got much narrower pavements, and because of mobility issues, because of access issues, chargers go not on the curb but in the road. But that also means that we have, curbside DC fast charging in Hackney, as well as curbside, curbside AC. And you can make curbside DC work pretty well because you can have two plugs on it. Cars can park in either direction, and it makes it pretty easy to access. Now,
yeah, I mean, wouldn't that be good? Sorry to interrupt you, Ed, but yes, that really resonated with me, because the amount of times that I've gone to a curbside charger and only to miss out, not because there isn't a spot, but because it's not the right spot and I cannot park my car in the opposite direction of travel, and it's quite frustrating. I mean, look, maybe I should just get a really long lead, but it certainly would make it a bit easier.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So, whilst Westminster sort of took an early lead on this, there's now an obligation on local authorities to identify everywhere chargers can be put. And there are different models to how these chargers get rolled out. There's also an obligation on DNOs, so they're the British DNSPs, to publish pretty up-to-date and accurate network maps on where the power is. So you can align these two, and in fact, you get the maps aligned. You can say, okay, well, there's a spot here. Council says they want to charge it. There's this much power, and then a CPO can go in and propose to put a charger in that location. In the case of Hackney have actually gone as far as to set up their own cooperative community energy retailer. I forget what it's called, but I think it's just called the Hackney Energy Co-op. And so they're not only providing electricity to residents and procuring renewable energy on behalf of residents, but they're also operating and in some cases building the chargers as well. So, there's lots of different models. And then there's, I guess, the final thing, and this is, maybe we're going to have to do another podcast and get, somebody else on, but there's no facility access fee. So this has been the big controversy in Australia. You want to hang a charger on a power pole, you've got to pay the DNSP some money. The DNOs, the councils that are allowing chargers into lampposts, and you don't really have power poles in London, but onto bits of electrical infrastructure, are not allowed to charge for it. The DNOs will make their money in the way that they make their money by distributing electricity to that outlet. But why is there no whole-mounted curbside charging in Melbourne? Well, it's because the DNSPs, they want $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 to hang something on a power pole, and at that price, there's no business. It's hard enough to make money out of AC charging in the first place. If if you're charging that kind of money to access the pole, you're done. Nobody's going to invest in that.
Yeah, that sounds like if we can get rid of that barrier, that sounds like that would be quite significant in our efforts here to really increase the amount of curbside charging available. Tim, do you have any thoughts on that?
Definitely, it sounds like a big barrier there. Was that figure per year, Ed, or is that the one-off fee to access the pole, or what's the?
That is apparently his annual fee. Prices are more reasonable in Sydney, which is why, but they're not. It's definitely not free.
Yeah, well, that's a big. Yeah, as you said, it's a big barrier to overcome. They're going to have to. It's going to have to be a pretty highly utilized charger with a decent margin to make that back and then make a profit. So, yeah.
Oh, let's hope we can. We can address that here, because it'd be great to see. As many curbside chargers as possible, just to I think that'd be a big difference, especially as there's increased the uptake of EVs here in Australia, and a lot of those people aren't going to have charging available at home. So, yeah. All right. Well, look, I think we've gone on long enough. I think we may have to have you back at some point, Ed, to discuss some more things around V2G, and it's a topic which I know that the readers of The Driven are particularly interested in, just seeing in the numbers of readers of articles about V2G and V2L, and it seems to be something which is very sort of hot topic at the moment. So, but I really appreciate you dialing in all the way from London there, or at the city of Winchester to be specific. We'll hope to have you back on soon. So, Tim, anything else from you before we wrap up?
Not from me. Thanks, Ed. Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in to this episode of the Driven podcast. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, and until then, take care, and we'll see you then.